Hello. We're in This Freedom Whence, John Wesley Bready, page 72, the last portion of Politics, the Penal Code, and Prisons. This section is entitled A Poignant Paradox. With all its perversions, however, English public life, particularly after 1750, was not so utterly retrograde as that of France. Even in the 8th decade of the century, that libertine autocrat, Louis XV, who had spent hundreds of millions of livres from the public treasury upon his vain, intriguing mistresses, could blatantly boast, quote, "In my person alone is the authority. Legislative power belongs to me alone. Public order emanates from me. I am its supreme guardian," unquote. In England, Parliament, for all its corruption, was a real instrument of government, expressing at least the opinions of a landed and privileged minority. Moreover, as Lecky points out, English law at this time, for all its cruelty, knew nothing of arbitrary imprisonment or of the barbarous punishment of the wheel, nor indeed of any other mode of designed diabolical torture. Howard's investigations, that is John Howard, the great figure in the reform of the prisons, John Howard's investigations too show that bad as were most English prisons, many continental lazarettos with their studied ghastly tortures were worse. Indeed, while Louis XV was still boasting that he was France, in England certain things truly majestic already were emerging amidst the surrounding chaos. More than 25 years before the century's close, the national conscience of England was beginning to awaken to the enormity of the slave traffic. 2 years before the storming of the Bastille, inspired solely by religious motives, the famous Abolition Committee was formed, and were it not for the French Revolution's setback to all reform in England, the suppression of the slave trade throughout the British Empire would have been an 18th century achievement. Long before the conclusion of the century, too, the South Sea Bubble finance was a closed chapter in British history. A new sense of sobriety, morality, and earnestness was everywhere appearing. Drunkenness no longer was fashionable. The trading justice and his justice shop were now but vaguely remembered. The crassness of the prison system was greatly ameliorated. Patriotism was assuming a more lofty significance. And already British courts of justice were beginning to win the admiration of the civilized world. A new moral outlook and philanthropic spirit were, in fact, everywhere apparent. A temperate, industrious, and religious middle class was springing rapidly into being, and a demand for parliamentary reform already was becoming vocal. One of the most poignant paradoxes, moreover, of this paradoxical century was that, though mobs frequently were exploited by their betters to sinister ends, and though both the Wesleys and Whitefield, that is, not only John Wesley, but his brother, the great hymn writer Charles, and George Whitefield, the other great evangelist of the period, the Wesleys and Whitefield were at times the objects of mob fury, yet, considering the range of their travels, the singularity of their methods, and the proportions of their program, these spiritual awakeners were wondrously received by the national multitude. True, John Wesley could, on occasion, refer to the beasts of the people, but this beastliness was generally the work of mobs plied with alcohol, or heated to local patriotism by squires, magistrates, parsons, or other designing gentlemen. This mob violence, too, when it occurred, was always local, not national. It was the exception, not the rule. The central government never interfered with Wesley's lifelong national crusade, and of the common people, whom Wesley so dearly loved, and to whom he ministered, it may truly be said that, despite glaring exceptions, they received him gladly. His intrepid courage, his transparent sincerity, his utter selflessness, his directness and dignity of appeal went straight to the hearts of the dispossessed throng. The sacred flame in his soul kindled the divine spark in theirs, and they recognized him for what he was, the friend of the people, the mediator of liberty, the prophet of God. Often on the hustings, the 18th century mob dealt no dealt to swashbuckling politicians black eyes, cracked heads, broken ribs. Indeed, so tempestuous was its fury when unleashed that Sir Walter Besant, in his close study of this period, pronounces the London mob brutal beyond all power of words to describe, or imagination to understand, so bestial that one is induced to think that there has never been in any town or in any age a population which could compare with them." End of quote. Yet in Wesley's case, all serious mob assaults in time collapsed. More than once, mob leaders with clubs raised over his head, but looked in his face and retired in shame, some to find their soul, and later to become class leaders in his cause. As Augustin Birrell puts it, quote, "The mob knew and appreciated the difference between a Bub Doddington and a John Wesley." End of quote. During the 53 years of his crusade, contesting 3 kingdoms for God, Wesley experienced no really serious injuries at the hands of the mob. And one of the amazing features of the mighty revival he led was the ever-increasing personal influence of this restrained, immaculate, erudite Oxford Don, whose speech always was classical English and whose bearing ever was that of the Christian gentleman, upon soldiers, sailors, publicans, miners, fishermen, smugglers, and the roughest industrial workers. Even as early as the 40s of the 18th century, by the mouth of the pit and the door of the workshop, vast throngs of horny-handed and face-begrimed toilers removed their hats and stood in rapt, reverent attention as Wesley, who never stooped to conquer, spoke to their souls of the eternal verities of earth and heaven, of body, mind, and spirit. Hundreds of English town commons and marketplaces were transfigured into cathedrals as multitudes kneeled solemnly on grass or cobblestones, turning wistfully their faces toward heaven, or burying them in their hands, as Wesley, in prayer, besought the Father God, through Christ, to send pardon, power, and peace to sin-stained and broken lives. Wesley probably rode more miles over English roads than any other man who ever bestrode a beast. He rode in all manner of weather, by day and by night, yet in an era when the thoroughfares of England were infested with highwaymen, never once was he robbed on the road. Often, also, the open-air crowds to whom he was preaching dealt a peremptory quietus to drunken gentlemen and other disturbers who tried to break up his services. And before his death, he was to witness many of no religious profession at all coming voluntarily after their working day to help the people called Methodists to build preaching houses. In brief, despite the cruelty and coarseness, the drunkenness and depravity of the age, the multitude could still recognize true nobility and respond to the touch of soul power. The British sense of sportsmanship, too, though perverted, was not extinct. And to Wesley's spiritual eyes, there was majesty latent even in the moral ruins of a prodigal and degraded, though inherently mighty, people. But all this is to anticipate, while both the perspective of our subject and the facts of history compel us to pause a little longer on the bleaker aspects of the age. For never can the problems the great revival faced to be understood or appraised unless we first see clearly and in further detail the incredibly difficult backgrounds in which it had to work. The next chapter is Dawn Deferred.